What's all this commotion now in the real estate industry with this settlement with the National Association of Realtors? Well, stay tuned and we're going to give you an update of where things stand with this settlement, what's going to be taking place as it goes into effect in August, and how it affects you and how you can be prepared for these changes. Hi, I'm Vincent Sear. Welcome to the Sear team, and we're going to talk to you about the National Association of Realtors, NAR, and the settlement that has taken place as a result of the lawsuits regarding commissions. So there's a bunch of changes taking place. They're all going to go into effect during the summer. You're going to start seeing rollouts take place. There has a date of August 17th is when the official rollout is going to be enforced. And we're going to talk to you about some of the changes that are taking place. Here's what really was the basis of all this. There was a bunch of lawsuits that were claiming that the real estate industry was not being forthright in how commissions were being discussed with both sellers and buyers. Who is paying, how those commissions are paid, whether or not because of how much commission is being paid out to cooperating agents, if some agents were neglecting to show all the properties that were available to specific buyers, and they were sort of filtering them out. And there was uncertainty with the consumer. Those were the claims. There was a lawsuit. There was actually a verdict that was in favor of the plaintiffs for his lawsuit, and as a result there's been a bunch of settlements between the National Association of Realtors, almost all the major brokerages, most of the MLSs that are owned by the realtor associations. And as a result of this settlement, there's going to be some things that are taking place. Some of them are going to be good. Some of them are going to be a little more challenging. Here are the key changes. One, commission rates will be more transparent between agents and clients. And we think that's a good thing. In the area we operate in, we are in Pennsylvania. We operate in Pennsylvania and Delaware and New Jersey. We've had buyer's agency and the disclosure of commissions of who's paying what in our documents for many, many years. But in some states, that was not the case. And so it was difficult for sellers and buyers to understand who is really paying the agent. And that's going to become more transparent because it's going to require more dialogue now. What are the other changes? Home buyers are going to need to be aware of instances where the listing broker may not offer to share their fees with the buyer's agent. In almost all cases, at least up until we get this settlement enacted, the seller is paying the listing broker a commission to sell the house. And if that house is on the MLS, more than likely that listing broker has been sharing that fee with the buyer's agent. And that is how the buyer's agent has been paid. Now, even if there's a buyer's agency agreement between the buyer and the buyer's agent that says the buyer is going to pay a certain fee for that agent's services, that has almost always been offset by what the listing broker has been sharing. We'll call that the co-op fee. Well, there's going to be instances right now where that fee may not be offered by the listing broker. The seller may not discuss or want the listing broker to share any kind of fee or provide enough money for the sharing of that fee. And so now the buyers may be more responsible for paying their agent's fee directly. And that's going to impact the buyer's ability to be able to afford the home, because this is going to be an additional amount of money, some percentage, we're not allowed to discuss percentage, but some percentage of the sale of the property that the buyer's agent is going to be due for their services. In the past, it was often paid for by the listing broker or shared by the listing broker, and now the buyer may be obligated to pay that fee directly because there is no other money coming in from anywhere else. So, as we said, the traditional commission structure is the seller paid a commission to the listing broker. The listing broker paid a portion of that commission to the buyer's agent. And this commission split was often not communicated directly or clearly to the buyers, and maybe not even to the sellers. It was noted on the MLS though, and the MLS was really the contractual location for the brokers to know how they were going to get paid by each other. And that was what was in dispute with this lawsuit, that sometimes that wasn't communicated clearly to the buyers. So the buyers and sellers didn't fully understand how commissions were paid. Sellers assumed they were paying the buyer's agent and that they were actually paying for somebody to negotiate against their interest. That's not necessarily true. Okay? The sellers are actually paying the listing agent or listing broker to sell the house. It's the listing broker that is sharing that fee with the buying broker. Okay, so the seller is not directly paying the buyer or the buyer's agent. Now, unfortunately, if you see a lot of settlement sheets, what was done to expedite things, instead of having the seller pay the listing broker the entire commission, and then later on have the listing broker take their portion that they were going to share with the buying broker and send it to them separately, the title companies and the brokers all thought it would be much more efficient if that was all done at the settlement table. So often on the settlement sheet, the seller is going to see payment to their broker to sell the house and a payment to the buying broker, which in effect is really what is being shared by the listing broker, but it doesn't look that way on the settlement sheet. The seller looks at it and says, why am I paying the buying broker? And that's what caused a lot of misunderstanding and helped the plaintiffs in this case actually convince the jury that this was not fair. Okay? At the same time, buyers didn't understand their obligations to pay the buyer's agent. Okay? Here in Pennsylvania, we've had buyer's agency for a long, long time. A lot of states don't have buyer's agency. They don't have this fiduciary relationship with their buyer as they're going to look at houses. But in a buyer's agency environment, the buyer negotiates a fee they're going to pay to their buyer's agent for their services. And often in that buyer's agency agreement, there's language in there that says, you are going to owe us this amount of money, or this amount based upon the price of the home and the percentage we've negotiated. However, if the home is in an MLS and the listing broker is offering to share some of their fee with the buying side, we will use that to offset what your obligation is to us. And in 99% of the cases, that money is sufficient to cover whatever the obligation the buyer had with their buyer's agent. And so the buyers didn't understand either that they are really paying for that buyer's agent services, but it's being paid for through the listing broker's share of the cooperating fee. But if that listing broker didn't offer anything, the buyer could have an obligation to pay that buyer's agent. That is going to be much more transparent now, because if you see the media, everything came out said the commissions are going to go away, the seller doesn't have to pay for the buying side anymore, and we're going to see instances now where we're not even going to know, okay, whether or not the listing broker is offering anything, okay, because these changes are going to be put into effect. One, the listing broker cannot display the buyer's agent or any kind of commission split in the MLS. So the MLS is not going to allow the displaying of any kind of sharing fee that the listing broker may have with the buying agent. So in the past, we could see what it was. We knew whether or not the buying agent was going to get paid. That could be communicated to the buyer, and the buyer understood they don't have to worry about that money because it's going to be offset through this co-op in the MLS. That's going away. We're not going to see that right now. Nobody will see that because it's not going to be allowed. In addition, buyers need to sign some sort of agreement before being shown a house that's listed in the MLS. Often, depending upon the state, that may have to be a buyer's agency agreement, but it's going to have to be some agreement that's going to discuss the buyer's agent's duties as well as the buyer's agent's fees and what the buyer's obligations could be for those services. That is going to be required before you can be shown a property in the MLS. Now, if you go and see a house in an open house, there's going to be exceptions in which that isn't going to be needed in order for you to go to an open house. But if you want to have a scheduled showing, you are going to need to have an agreement with your buyer's agent in place. And the listing agent is probably going to have to put together some mechanism in order to verify that. Sellers are no longer, they've never been obligated to offer any kind of sharing arrangement with the listing broker's fee to the buying agent. Some people will say, well, this is a new thing. It's not, okay? A couple things that are not new. They've always been out there, but they seem to have been forgotten. One, commissions have always been negotiable. From way back after many, many lawsuits back in the 1950s, everywhere you see in any kind of listing agreement, or you should be seeing, is where there are no fixed fees. There are no standard commissions. Every commission is negotiable between the seller and their seller's agent, between the buyer and the buyer's agent. You're going to see language on everything you sign now that's going to have that in bold. It's the way it's been, but part of the settlement is they're going to reiterate what has been in place again. In addition, sellers have never been obligated to offer anything to the buying broker or to have a discussion with their listing broker about whether or not they're going to offer anything to the buying broker. Now, it's been part of the standard practice for many years now because this facilitates the sale. The buyers are coming pretty much with all the money they have. Okay, so sellers have been using this mechanism to make sure the buyer who has buyer's agency has a mechanism to pay for that service, has the representation, and doesn't have to worry about coming up with that money in addition to coming up with the money to buy the house, money to close on the house with the closing costs, and really provide their best offer to that seller. You're going to see sellers now who are not going to want to offer any kind of other commission to the buying side, which is fine. That's their right to do so. That may have impact on how many buyers may come see the property, but that's a different story right now. Another change is that buyers may need to pay their agent's fees directly. So because the buyer's agent is not maybe getting money from the listing broker as part of the transaction, the buyers are going to have the fees necessary to pay that agent at settlement. And that's going to have to be put into their calculus of, do they have the money to buy the house? Do they have the money to close on the house? And do they have the money to pay their agent? And you may see buyers decide to bypass the buyer's agent and go directly to the listing agent, but that isn't necessarily going to help their cause, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Buyer's agents are going to need to disclose the commission details to buyers, not only in the relationship the buyer has with their agent, but the buyers are going to have to the buyer's agents are going to have to find out from the listing agent for each property that's being shown whether or not that seller and listing agent are going to offer any kind of compensation to the buyer's agent for their services as part of their transaction. Because if they are, that will help the buyer understand that they don't necessarily have to come up with the buyer's agent money on that transaction. If they are not, the buyer's agent needs to communicate that to the buyer, because that could be an added cost as part of the transaction. And the buyer has to make a determination of whether or not that's a property they actually want to see and go for, because it may cost them more than what they have. So this is going to have to take place as we start looking at properties. I think as a buyer's agent, I've got a duty to inform my buyer, hey, there's an additional cost this property is going to have. Not only are I have to go pay more than ask, and not only have to risk some contingencies as potentially in this offer, you also are going to have to be on the hook to pay for my fees, because we're getting nothing from the listing broker on this one. I need to disclose that before the buyer starts falling in love with the property and we start writing an offer. And because we no longer have the MLS as the contract mechanism between brokerages about that money that could be paid by the listing broker to the buying agent, we're going to need to get something in writing that says that that listing broker is offering something, or the listing broker is offering something less or nothing, so that we have something contractual so the buyer knows what their obligation may be. This is going to put friction in the transaction and in the process. So how about an impact on dual agency? Well, dual agency, I think, is going to become more difficult. Now, there are discussions out there about you're going to see more dual agency because the buyers are going directly to the listing agent. Well, if they go directly to the listing agent, they still need to have a buyer's agency agreement with that agent to see that property if it's on the MLS. That's still a requirement now. In addition, if you do so, you're going to have a dialogue with your seller, because the seller may not want you representing anybody but them. And you have a question about whether or not you can really become 100% loyal to two different parties. You also have the instance where you may have states in which they don't allow dual agency. So the buyer is still going to have to get an agent anyway, or somebody to be able to show the property, and it's going to potentially cost them some money. So I think that we're going to have more and more risk on dual agency. I think dual agency is not something that people are going to want to entertain as much, because I think you're going to be prone to more lawsuits. I think you're going to be prone to more misrepresentation. And I think the buyer is really going to be underserved in those scenarios, because in the end, it's the seller who's paying that agent. In addition, both buyer and seller have to agree to dual agency, which they may not do. And if no commission split is being offered to the buyer side, well, the buyer still needs to pay for that agent's services. There's services and activities that take place on the buy side, even if you're dual agent. The reason people did dual agency in the past is because they would pick up both sides of the commission. They'd pick the listing side of the commission and the buyer side of the commission. Well, if there's no buyer side commission being offered, then you're asking a listing agent to do a bunch of buyer side work and not getting paid for it. That's not going to happen. And you want to be careful, because you, as a seller, want to be careful if you are now taking a buyer who's unrepresented, who wants to represent themselves. Because an unrepresented buyer is not going to help navigate that transaction for their responsibility as well. And you have a great risk of fall-throughs or something going wrong through that process. So we've got a lot of different dynamics that are going to take place, and you're really going to need to spend time with your agent, whether or not you're selling your property or whether or not you're out to buy a property, of really understanding what's going on. And I got to tell you right now, it's going to be hard as we try to figure some of this out. And it's going to seem like it's a lot of extra work and maybe extra costs and a lot of extra activity. Please, please, please don't blame the agents. This is not anything of our doing. This is not anything that we asked for. This is a result of a bunch of people out there feeling as though they were wrong and were able to get enough attorneys to be able to help them and get some decision made, of which the NAR and the brokerages had to capitulate, considering how much money was at stake. But I can tell you right now, I think the process is going to become less efficient. I think it's going to become more clunky. And I think it's going to open itself up to lots of unintended consequences that we need to prepare for, because they will arise as we navigate through these changes. Stay tuned for part 2 as we discuss more and more of what's taking place with these changes and how we're going to be able to help you through those. As always, if you like what you see, give us a like, give us a subscribe, write us a comment, ask us a question. We'll be glad to be able to answer you and provide you more and more content. Have a great day.